Welcome back to the Digital Portrait Drawing course. We are now in Lesson 7, and in this lesson, we will be drawing the nose. Okay, so here we are back in Photoshop again. This is how our portrait is looking after the previous lesson where we were detailing the eyes. The only differences that I've made is I've grouped the sketch and shade layers together just to sort of clean up our layers panel here, and I've added in the reference nose for us to look at, so I didn't need to spend time doing that during the recording. So let's go ahead and jump right in and get started. I'm going to add a new layer. This is going to be the nose guide layer. And on this layer, we will put some construction guidelines in to help us make sure the nose is in the place where it needs to be and just sort of guide us towards rendering this appropriately. Now, as you get more experience with portrait drawing, you won't need to do this, but in this case, we're brand new at it, so let's go ahead and take care of that. But before we do it, I should mention that drawing the female nose from straight ahead is one of the most difficult ways to draw a nose. And especially with the straight on view, there's not a lot of solid lines to work with. So it's all in very subtle shading that you have to depend on to form the shape of the nose. And that's a lot harder to do than if it's just a solid line from, say, the profile where you can just draw out the line, or even the three-quarter view where we have more hard shapes to deal with. But the straight on view of the female nose is one of the more difficult. So don't get too frustrated if this lesson turns out to be hard for you. Go ahead and just work your way through it, knowing that if you can get this one down, you can get the nose of anyone down. Okay, so to make sure we are getting things where it needs to be, there's this little trick where we can draw some guidelines. If you go from the outside corner of the mouth through to the outside corner of the opposite eye, and do that on both of them, although in this case it's kind of hard to see where the opposite corner of this eye is. Put it out here. Now, this X that we formed, the center of it will form where the point of the nose should be. So our little sketch lines have actually got that rendered out there pretty well. So let's go ahead and put in a couple other construction lines. I'm finding these lines to be a little bit dark, so I'm going to decrease the opacity of my brush. Okay, now the center line here, it's tempting to go ahead and start the box there, but I actually prefer to do it from the top of the eye line, because the very top of the eye line tends to be where the top of that bridge of the nose ends up being more often than not. So I like to do a line straight across here, and then grab the inside corner and go straight down with it. Inside corner, straight down. And that should line up to where the edges of the nose are. Now, as we see in our original sketch, that's a little bit off, so we'll have to compensate for that as we're drawing. Alright, so let's do another horizontal right here. Okay, now comes the fun part. The tip of the nose should be seen essentially as a circle. So it's like a round ball on the very tip there. Alright, and from that round ball, let's add our center point, our center line, going straight up. Alright, and from here, we connect the outside of that circle almost straight up, but just tilt it in a little bit until we meet that horizontal line on both sides. Okay, and then we go from this middle point here, where the X is on the tip of the nose, bring that out to where this point meets, and pull that up to intersect with that line. Alright, and then we get another line here about the same width as that circle, and then using that we sort of match the shape of the nose coming through. Alright, and then this will help serve as a guide for the shading and the other rendering of the nose. So I'm going to pull that down because that's just there as a guide. Okay, so now let's add a nose detail layer. Grab our HB pencil. Well, we want to make sure we can see our reference image. And notice the deep pockets of shadow underneath the nostril. Now they're not solid black, but they are definitely darker than the rest. That's the darkest area of the nose in this case. She's got a a fairly regular shaped nose, but so many noses come in so many different shapes and sizes. You really got to study the different reference materials that you have available and then choose which type of nose that you want to illustrate. In this case, we're going to do this one because it's right here and it's easier for us to do. So we begin by going through and just sketching in those details. Now it's also at this point you want to try to correct some of the sketch problems that we saw before, like with the nose not coming over as far as it probably should have. Okay, I think some of that detail in there is probably a little bit even too much. Pull that out a little bit with the eraser. Okay, time for the shading layer. And for that, let's grab our 2B pencil and then reduce the opacity down to 20 and start blocking in some of these shadows. Now notice the shadowing underneath the nose. We want to make sure that we capture that the best we can. Because even though the lighting's not bright, the nose does protrude from the face, and you give it volume and depth by adding the shading areas. And the same is up along this ridge line here, going underneath the nose and creating that ball area, and then the V-shaped shading over the top of the little wing there. And the bridge of the nose does carry straight up into the brow. So the two things are locked together, and you want to make sure that you indicate that. But the bridge itself does have an indentation, so that's also going to be captured within the shading. Okay, and also notice on the far side there's a little bit of shadow in there, not much of one, so that's very faint, and you want to make sure things blend up nicely into the eye socket. Now at this point, I think I've shaded it over a little too much, so I'm going to switch to my eraser tool and start cleaning that up a little bit. Like it's a little strong up there, I think, in the bridge. Bring the opacity down to about 40. A little strong up there. We want to make sure we catch a little highlight along here and keep the ball of the nose nice and sharp too. Okay, that's looking pretty good. Let's go ahead and turn off that nose guide so we can begin to see some of the shape and volume within this nose to make sure that we're handling things appropriately. Okay, it's at this point that you may notice some of the previous drawn layers are going to be conflicting with what you're drawing now. For instance, the Titan layer has some odd lines in there for the nose that aren't quite where they needed to be. So I'm going to grab that layer and use my eraser tool and just pull those out. Also the shading in the shading copy area has a little bit too straight for my taste right here along the nose. So I'm going to go ahead and form those on each one as needed to help define exactly where I want the light to fall. Alright, let's go ahead and close that up and return our attention into the nose layers. Now let's go ahead and group these together. Select them all, Control or Command G. So this is our nose. Alright, so now let's do the merge trick again. So we've got the nose layers into a single merged layer. Hide that construction group, so I'm working just with the nose layer itself. I'm finding this little arrowhead over here is a little bit too hot, a little bit too visible, so I'll knock that down some with the eraser tool and make a copy of this. And as before, go ahead and blur this one. We'll use a Gaussian blur of 15 pixels this time. And that's starting to do really well in creating the volume and form of the nose as we need it to. Okay, that's really starting to look like a nicely done nose. Now, you may be wondering, what do you do if after you've done the merging of these groups and the adjustment there with the blur, if you need to go in and make some edits to it? Do you have to go all the way back and re-merge it? Well, you could do that. Or you could just go ahead and add an additional layer and start making those edits right there on top of that. For example, let's try to get a little more emphasis on this side of the nose here. Okay, because that defines that tip of the nose a little bit better and also separates out the wing on this side from the central area of the nose. But it doesn't really match the shading because it's not blurred like the rest of it is. So let's just go ahead and blur that. Fill Filter blur, Gaussian blur. Probably decrease the blur pixels on this a little bit. There we go. Now that matches right in there. Okay, now if you look at the nose here, you can see the dark areas aren't really matching in tone with the dark areas of the eyes. And we want some consistency of tone throughout the entire image. So let's go ahead and add a new, let's say, accents layer. Grab our 2B brush and just start laying in some of the darker tones there, just to help add a little bit of the contrast that we need. And that's looking pretty good. I'm really liking the way that's coming out. Okay, one of the benefits of using the several layers technique like I'm showing here is that if something is badly aligned or misproportioned, it's a lot easier to fix this way. For instance, if we just grab all of those nose layers, hit Control or Command T, we can actually turn the nose. Now that does have some of the underlying sketch layers that we'd have to do the same thing for in the sketch and shade group, but otherwise that's a pretty mobile nose. So let's go ahead and get rid of the reference nose and just take a look at that. Not too shabby. So that's working pretty well. So that concludes lesson 7 in how to draw the nose. Be sure to grab lesson 8 where we will continue on and draw the mouth.